Today we're going to be entering into a really interesting topic. We're going to be asking the broad question, is there fossil evidence of human evolution? This is one of the concerns which naturally tends to come up, especially for those who have been induced into the natural sciences through their educational background. Somewhere along the way they've encountered this meta-narrative of culture. This idea is such a common cultural narrative that in some cases it actually can block gospel reception. And so therefore this is one of those areas of discussion which is really obligatory as we move through our tour of Christian evidences. So we need to start by asking the general question, did we evolve from apes? Well, the recent discovery of Homo Naledi has summoned culture to reevaluate what it means to be human. And yet, in keeping with predictions that were issued relatively the same year, our ministry, for example, gave a prognostication of how exactly the significance of that find would wind up playing itself out. Well, interestingly enough, we wound up being right. So what does this mean for the broader field of research? Well, we're going to find out a little bit about that today. Let's look first at the discovery of Homo Naledi. In a September 2015 issue of National Geographic, executive editor for science, Jamie Shrevey, wrote the following words. Give it a listen. Quote, "Scientists have discovered a new species of human ancestor deep in a South African cave, adding a baffling new branch to the family tree." Well, the discovery here was thought to be part of the shared ancestral story of apes and human beings. And though the placement of the fossils initially rendered any age estimate uncertain, the discovery was nonetheless published years ahead of schedule, which was really a sad thing. Surprisingly, no collective voice of caution from the broader scientific community managed to slow down the untimely announcement, because the writer of the article spoke eagerly of the new finding, calling it, quote, "one of the greatest fossil discoveries of the past half-century." Well, for these and other reasons, the story tended to call to mind a very similar discovery made in 1924 by one Raymond Dart. Heralded at the time as one of the most important fossil finds of its day, it received great acclaim as a sound advance for the theory of evolution. It was immediately announced as an intermediate link between apes and human beings. And so thus, for a time, it enjoyed widespread success amongst the broader scientific community of its day. However, by 1973, there was a South African geologist by the name of T.C. Partridge who had actually successfully debunked the hastily dated and published finding. For he showed that the cave within which the skull was found really could be no more than 0.75 million years old. And so this meant that the skull really could not be, after all, a missing link between apes and human beings. It was far too young. Instead, it would more properly belong to some previously unknown species of ape, one which had long ago gone extinct. Well, sadly, Partridge's pronouncement scarcely succeeded in straightening accounts for any great length of time. For a new generation of scientists later reclassified Dart's gimcrack work once again as, quote, evidence for evolution. Fancy that. And so thus, despite all those who had previously wondered whether the skull could even be related to human beings, the discovery has now disturbingly, once again, mysteriously found itself rejoining our, quote, common ancestral tree. And so when faced with such persistence, and if we are honest, stubbornness, it is truly difficult to resist from asking the question, what will it take for the evolutionist to reconsider his views? Well, recently I was challenged by a young college student at a local fitness club. In discussion, this very line of questioning came up. I asked him to consider the evidence for God's existence, and he simply responded to me by shouting out, "What about the cavemen?" The young man's reply immediately demonstrated his rather high regard for fossil evidence of human evolution. He clearly viewed the list of popular proofs as an impressive exhibit, one which was virtually impossible to contest. And yet he also seemed ignorant of the many scientists today who have publicly aired their doubts on the soundness of evolutionary belief. In fact, it is a surprising backdrop to one of the most famous stories in history, one which is being told by the patron protectors of the theory itself. Andrew Hill, for example, to name only one such proponent, is a well-known educator at an Ivy League school. As professor of paleoanthropology at Yale University, one might imagine that Hill's views would temper the recent exuberance of National Geographic. For an issue of one of the most prestigious scientific periodicals in print today, Hill dryly commented on the sensational nature of fossil reporting, stating, quote, "Every new fossil hominid specimen is always the most important ever found and solves all known problems." And yet, Hill's skepticism is really only the beginning of the story. There are others telling doubts of an even more radical nature. Richard Leakey, for example, another leading evolutionary proponent, has written extensively on our current theory of origins. Describing the differences between skulls of missing links and those of modern men, he wrote the following surprising admission. These differences are probably no more pronounced than we see today between the separate geographical races of modern humans. And so for this reason, I gathered that the young man who stood before me had never been made aware of these somewhat disturbing irresolutions. Nor could he have known about the history of these problems, that they have really always haunted evolutionists, including Leakey's own predecessors. For in perhaps one of the most startling early admissions to date, Ernest Houghton of Harvard University wrote, quote, "One can with equal facility model on a Neanderthaloid skull the features of a chimpanzee or the ligaments of a philosopher." You can see how revealing that comment is. What exactly do you want this model to look like in the picture? Aristotle? Or a member of the cast from the film Planet of the Apes? You tell us. It's up to artistic interpretation. And so Houghton therefore went on to conclude his somewhat revealing critique of evolutionary belief by issuing a rarely contemplated warning. He claimed that any 3D models of missing links would have, quote, very little, if any, scientific value, and would be, quote, likely to mislead the public. Oh my goodness. Comments? Yes.
Okay. First, my question actually, two? Or they both go together. So when did Andrew Hill and Richard Leakey make these statements? Like, when are they from? Are they, and when you said current origin theory, current?
Well, Andrew Hill published his comments in an article entitled Review of Hominid Evolution, edited in a journal called Nature. This is published in September of 1986. His comments are surprisingly contemporary. Now, it's important for me to note at this point that none of these statements comes from the pen of a Christian philosopher. Instead, the majority of these quotations are taken from scientific publications written by insiders, professionally credentialed, and in most cases peer-reviewed. In other words, these are the honest wrestlings of men committed to evolution and yet nevertheless troubled by the evidence they see. Indeed, their words seem to concur with the late D.M.S. Watson, who admitted that they did not hold to evolution because it could be, quote, proved by logically coherent evidence to be true. Yes, Mr. Peltier?
No, I'm just saying that's stupid. I mean anybody with
it's
a
hasty.
mind would understand, like, okay, where's the evidence? I mean,
Right, we need to find some evidence here, and where you lack evidence, it's okay to entertain other possibilities. Just seems like a reasonable thing to do.
Right.
Ms. Olson?
Do you know, I mean, my daughter's coming home from school and they're teaching evolution in school, so I mean,
Yes.
do they currently present, is she just, I mean, you're not there, so I guess you can't specifically know, but I mean, do they present both sides of this? Are they just showing her one way? Because
It's-
I don't know how to come at it when she asks me these questions, and I guess I'll learn. But
Yeah, you have a daughter, and daughter's kind of submerged into this stuff.
evolution is, yeah, so-
Must be fact. It's settled science. I think the problem with the American educational establishment is that Darwinism has become such an entrenched set of assumptions that other possibilities are not even entertained. That said, jumping back into the story, there is really kind of a sad thing. Much to my dismay, the young man whom I spoke with at the fitness club just simply refused to listen. His professors, it seemed, had successfully justified his atheism. And so he therefore chose to overlook my warnings regarding the entire field of research, not just rejecting my reasoning, but my mention of its hoaxes. That's right, hoaxes. Now, these were famously cooked up by the scientists themselves. Each of them happened to be motivated by success in their respective areas of research. And so for this reason, Mary Lakey once warned her newly arrived paleoanthropologist Jonathan Kolb, quote, "Don't trust anyone, not even your best friends," end quote. Oh my goodness, could you imagine such a thing? First day on the job, go ahead and pitch your tent at the corner of the camp, come to the general commons area, we're going to have dinner together, and oh, by the way, don't trust anyone on this dig site. Well, truth, as they say, is often stranger than fiction, a la Mark Twain. Apparently, the field of paleoanthropology is no exception. Indeed, one need not turn to the chronicles of Indiana Jones to find stories of ancient dig sites filled with intrigue and marvelous suspense. Instead, the mysterious account of Piltdown Man will certainly suffice for that. The discovery was made by Charles Dawson in 1915. And yet, despite its early success, it later went on to become the subject of extraordinary duress, as in just 29 years, the entire discovery was found to be nothing but an elaborate fraud. Well, how did it turn out to be a fraud? Well, it's interesting that no one noticed this for such a great span of time, but Piltdown Man, the famous Piltdown Man in Piltdown, England, turned out to be really nothing more than a human skull that was fitted with the jawbone of an orangutan, a feat performed by filing down the TMJ joint to make this possible. So much for Piltdown Man, so much for evolution.
Who named that?
But by a long shot, well, they still don't know. Interestingly, the case of Piltdown Man has never been solved. So you see it on the History Channel, Unsolved Mysteries. In any respect, by a long shot, possibly the most disturbing trend amongst paleoanthropologists is the way in which evidence against the theory of evolution is often handled. Facts and clues overturning the theory are frequently ignored and at times deliberately misreported. Perhaps the most noteworthy of these was the discovery of a human elbow bone found in 1965 in northern Kenya. Appallingly, it was described at the time not as a human elbow bone, but as, quote, the oldest fossil hominid ever found. Think to yourself, excuse me? They're calling a human elbow bone the oldest fossil ape man ever found? I mean, why are they saying that? Well, listen to how W. Howells, who was one of the discoverers of the find, commented on the data in 1981. He writes, quote, "The fragment, with a date of about 4.4 million years, could not be distinguished from Homo sapiens as humans." And so thus, in his own report, Howells here is expressly admitting that the elbow bone of this quote-unquote ape was indistinguishable from modern humans. And yet the discovery team here chose to classify the find as belonging to some form of ancient ape. Why? Well, for the simple reason that the notion of modern humans living before their apish ancestors would utterly overturn the theory of evolution. And so therefore, the implications of the data would harm the intent of the research. So the find was reinterpreted to fit the favored theory. Turn back to your first page of the notes for a moment and look there at the very simple diagram, figure A. Notice that the emergence of the Australopithecine ape occurs approximately 3.5 million years ago. The emergence of the species Homo is 2.5 million years ago. And then, of course, the emergence of modern humans, 0.2 million years old. So the discovery that we're discussing right now is roughly 4.4 million years ago. You can see by looking at this handy-dandy time chart that is roughly off the map. Boy, if modern humans are living before the Australopithecine ape, Houston, we've got a problem.
Just so it's with you still?
Yes.
Okay, so it's saying that that fragment couldn't have been, it could have been either. There's no way to say it was one or the other. Is that in 4.4 million years ago?
Fossils are, this is a complex problem. Without getting into some of the broader difficulties with the discipline, I say that the main problem here is that this bone, which resembled a human elbow bone, was found to date at 4.4 million years ago, which is just simply too old for the emergence of modern humans, which occurs, according to the chart I just showed you, 0.2 million years ago. So therefore, it is essentially a fossil out of time. And that's actually continually what seems to be happening here. We routinely seem to stumble upon anomalies in the field of evolutionary research, especially as it pertains to biological declination from apes to humans. There, the problem gets even trickier, so that Darwin's tree of life looks more like a bush of life and presents serious problems for Darwin's basic predilections. That's really the problem. And we're going to look in more detail on that in the next session. Mr. Grunison.
So, I'm just wondering what the agenda behind all this is, because it seems as if like
That's a tough one.
It's got to be like to disprove creationism, like, because
Creationism.
Creationism, and then if it wasn't like, if it's just to figure out where we come from, they would have disregarded this so long ago. It just seems like.
Yeah, and here I want to be careful how you interpret my presentation this morning. I'm not trying to say that the Andrew Hill and company are sort of the scientific Illuminati trying to dupe the world. Everyone's sitting in a smoke-filled room someplace at the back of a bar saying, how are we going to fool the public with this thing? I don't think it's anywhere near that deliberate.
Right.
But what it does perhaps come back to is a fundamental problem of the human condition. Turn with me in your Bibles, if you would, to answer this question, to Romans chapter 1. Here, Romans chapter 1, beginning with verse 16, for the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all the ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made. So they are without excuse. Verse 21, for although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools. So some time ago, I was standing in a halfway house, a Christian halfway house in a city that I will not mention for purposes of anonymity, before a group of men who were high-level sex offenders. Some of them had actually perpetrated crimes on children. And as I stood there that day, I did not feel led, I have to tell you, my sermon to start preaching on John 3:16, for God so loved the world. Rather, I felt to start my message that day by turning to Romans chapter 1. I said to them, gentlemen, the reason why you ended up in this situation in the first place has nothing to do with your violating the laws of man. The real reason why you ended up in this place is because you chose to suppress the knowledge of God in your mind. Now, what happens if you harbor no belief that there is a transcendent, invisible God able to actually behold the innermost thoughts of your mind and heart?
Everything's permissible.
Everything is permissible. And human beings become given over to the sickest and most depraved imaginations possible. Well, returning to the story here, sadly, the young man at the fitness club who stood before me just simply chose to turn tail and just chose to walk away. No amount of urging upon him on my part seemed sufficient to somehow deter the man. And yet little could he imagine that my Christian view of origins was by no means endangered from his naturalistic arguments for evolution. For in fact, no naturalistic theory of human beginnings has been shown to be equal to the task of ousting God. In the first chapter of Genesis, the sacred writer declares as follows: "So God created man in his own image." The Imago Dei. Now, to date, no fossil evidence has ever been uncovered which has soundly vanquished the force of these solemn words. In fact, the evidence time and again has refuted the theory of evolution. It has shown the relatively weak brandish of proofs which are propping the theorem erect. For as one well-known science magazine stated some years ago, the entire hominid collection known today would barely cover a billiard table. Now, of course, the situation has changed since then. This is a dated comment. It's really not a lot of evidence. The situation, in some respects, has grown no better. And in fact, as I've indicated earlier, it's actually worsening. And so perhaps this is why late science journalist Constance Holden likened the task of sorting evolutionary evidence to, quote, reconstructing the plot of War and Peace from 13 randomly selected pages. Though the pool of evidence has certainly grown since the time the above comments were published, the situation can hardly be said to be much better today. In fact, vast division still remains as to whether or not science can offer us a single, orderly account of human evolution. So given such a problem, one cannot help but wonder why the theory persists in spite of the many challenges it faces today. And so, hence in closing, just referring to your session guide, point 6, Unsolved Mysteries of Evolution, here I offer a list of 8 questions which to date no evolutionist has ever been able to adequately address. Now, interestingly enough, these questions were not collected by a Christian critic of evolution, but by well-known evolutionary proponent Carl Zimmer. Interesting. Zimmer asks, 1. Who was the first hominid? 2. Why do we walk upright? 3. Why are our brains so big? 4. When did we first use tools? My goodness, does that strike you as a really important step in the process of evolution to isolate and identify if you are going to say with certainty that humans have evolved from apes? Zimmer continues, how did we get modern minds? 6, why did we outlive our relatives? 7, what genes make us human? And 8, have we stopped evolving? And so in light of these rather penetrating questions, it is my view that unless modern science can present a reasonable resolution to these troubling issues, naturalists and evolutionists should be more open-minded to the possibility that their views may in fact be incorrect. And so perhaps given the current state of affairs, atheists could begin to give thought to other alternative worldviews. For as Malcolm Muggeridge wrote in his well-read book, The End of Christendom, what he suggested is that the entire theory of evolution may itself now be on the endangered species list. Give it a listen. He wrote, quote, I myself am convinced that the theory of evolution, especially to the extent to which it has been applied, will be one of the greatest jokes in the history books of the future. Posterity will marvel that so very flimsy and dubious an hypothesis could be accepted with the incredible credulity it has. Given what we have seen, it is therefore high time that we reopened our discussion of origins to include religious or perhaps even supernatural possibilities. Well, perhaps we should just conclude the session by saying, you answer the question.